She had 48 hours to disappear. Instead, she walked into a room full of killers and grabbed the hand of the most dangerous one. Her name was Naomi Ellis, a linguistics professor from Los Angeles who could speak 7 languages, but couldn't find a single word to describe what her own father had done to her. He had sold her. Quietly. Casually. Like settling a debt with loose change. Now men with guns were hunting her through the streets of Seoul, and the only thing standing between her and a body bag was a stranger who hadn't yet decided whether to save her or finish the job himself. If this story pulls you in, stay until the end. Like this video, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain came down the way bad news always does, without warning, without mercy, and all at once. Naomi Ellis ran, not jogged, not hurried. Ran. The way a person runs when their lungs are burning and their shoes are soaked through and every shadow that moves at the edge of their vision might be the last thing they ever see. Her coat was wrong for the weather. Her bag was too heavy. She'd grabbed it from the hotel room in a panic, shoving her passport and her mother's medical files and $3,000 in cash into the bottom of it. Because when you're running from men your father hired to drag you back, you don't stop to pack neatly. Seoul at 2 in the morning was not the city she remembered from her academic conference 6 months ago. It was all neon and slick pavement and the smell of fried food drifting from stalls that were still somehow open, vendors watching her with the flat, bored expressions of people who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. She ducked into a side alley, pressed her back against the cold stone wall, and forced herself to stop, to listen. Footsteps. 2 sets. Maybe 3. Moving fast, not running. They didn't need to run. They knew this city. She didn't. She pressed her palm against her sternum like she could manually slow her heart down through sheer force of will. 14 years of academic discipline, 2 doctorates, fluency in Korean, Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, French, Spanish, and the ugly cousin of all of them, her native English. None of it was useful right now. Right now, she needed something she had never been trained for. She needed to survive the next 10 minutes. Her phone buzzed. She almost threw it into the gutter before she saw the name. Daniel Park, her one contact in Seoul, a junior professor she'd met at a linguistics symposium. The message was 4 words. They know where I am, which meant they knew where she was going. She shoved the phone back into her bag and stepped back out into the rain without a plan, which was new for her. Naomi Ellis had always had a plan. She'd had a plan when her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. She'd had a plan when the university denied her tenure review the first time. She'd had a plan for everything, except for the night she came home to find her father sitting at the kitchen table with a man she didn't recognize, and heard the words that restructured her entire understanding of who Robert Ellis was. She'll be delivered to Mr. Chen's representatives within the week. Delivered. Like freight. Like something you shipped from one place to another without asking it how it felt about the journey. She'd stood in the hallway outside that kitchen for 11 seconds before she understood that the debt her father was describing, the $7 million he'd borrowed and lost across 3 years of bad investments and worse gambling, was being settled with the only asset he had left that someone else wanted. Her. She hadn't confronted him. That was the detail that still scraped against her when she lay awake at 3 in the morning. She hadn't walked into that kitchen and screamed at him, or demanded an explanation, or thrown anything. She'd stood there for 11 seconds, turned around, gone upstairs, and started packing. Because somewhere in the architecture of her brain, the part that assessed language and subtext and the meaning beneath the meaning of what people said, she understood that confrontation would only accelerate the timeline. Robert Ellis had already made his decision. Her father was already gone. What was sitting at that kitchen table was just a man with a debt and a solution. She'd been running for 11 days. The alley emptied out onto a wider street, and she saw it through the rain. Warm light spilling from tall glass doors, a restaurant, the kind of place that didn't have its name anywhere visible because the people who ate there already knew what it was called. 2 men in dark suits stood outside under an awning, not bouncers exactly, but not far from it. The kind of posture that communicated without any words at all that you needed to be someone before you walked through those doors. Behind her, she heard the footsteps get closer. She didn't think. Later, she would try to reconstruct the exact logic of what she did next, and she would fail because there wasn't any logic. There was only the animal calculation of immediate survival, the part of the human brain that bypasses everything civilized and educated and carefully constructed and just moves. She walked toward the doors. One of the suited men stepped slightly forward, a half-inch of resistance in his posture. She said, in flawless, soul-accented Korean, that her husband was waiting for her inside, that she was late, and she named a table number she invented on the spot. The suited man's posture shifted. Not much, just enough. He stepped aside. She went in. The restaurant was everything the outside wasn't. Quiet, warm, dark wood and low light, and the kind of silence that expensive rooms always have. The silence of people who don't raise their voices because they've never needed to. Maybe 15 tables, all occupied. Suits and silk and the muted clink of crystal. Every head turned toward her when she walked in, and she must have looked exactly like what she was. Drenched, breathing too fast, eyes too wide. The kind of woman who had just run 2 miles in the rain and was now standing inside a place that cost more per plate than most people made in a week. She scanned the room in the practiced way of someone whose job was reading people, reading the tiny shifts of expression and body language that told you more than words ever would. The table closest to the back wall. 3 men. 2 of them leaning forward in the posture of men conducting business, which meant they were subordinates. The one sitting back, the one whose spine never touched his chair, the one who had turned toward her not with curiosity but with assessment. That one was different. He was younger than she expected. Maybe 32, 33, black suit, no tie, the kind of face that would be handsome if it ever made a concession toward warmth. His eyes were very still. They didn't move around the room the way most people's eyes did when a stranger walked in soaking wet at 2 in the morning. They just found her and stayed. She heard the restaurant door open behind her. She didn't look back. She already knew. Her feet moved before her brain finished the sentence. She crossed the room in 8 steps and did the thing that some functional part of her mind would spend the next 6 months trying to explain. She reached down, found his hand where it rested on the table, and took it. His fingers were warm. The skin was rough in a way that didn't match the suit. She felt him go very still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm but is the thing just before a decision. She looked at him. She said quietly in Korean, "Please, 2 minutes." His face gave her nothing. His hand didn't move. The man who had followed her in stopped a few feet away. She could feel him there without turning around. The 2 subordinates at the table had both gone rigid, hands moving below the table line. Nobody in the room was breathing normally anymore. Then the man whose hand she was holding looked past her, up at whoever had followed her in, and said 3 words in a register so flat it barely qualified as speaking. "She's with me." His name, she would learn later, was Kieran Hwan. She didn't know that yet. What she knew in that moment was that the man at the enforcer's side exchanged a look with the other enforcer, and that look meant something had shifted in the calculation of what to do next, because you didn't pull a woman out from under a man like the one at this table, not in a room like this, not with the kind of weight the room was giving him. The enforcers left. The glass doors closed. And she was still standing next to a stranger's table, holding his hand, in a restaurant that cost more per breath than she made in a month. She let go of his hand. He didn't acknowledge the release. He said something to the 2 men across from him in Japanese. She caught it, registered it, without showing that she had. It was a polite deferral, 5 more minutes to attend to a small family matter. And the 2 men nodded with the kind of stiff formality that meant they were either investors or executives or both. They rose, excused themselves to a lounge area near the front, and then it was just the 2 of them at the table at the back of the room. And Kieran Hwan looked at her the way a man looks at something that has landed on his table that he doesn't yet have a category for. "Sit down," he said. English. Perfect. No accent whatsoever. "You look like you're going to fall over." She sat. She didn't intend to let herself look as exhausted as she was, but her legs made the decision before her pride could object. A glass of water appeared in front of her. She didn't know when the server materialized or when they disappeared. She drank half of it before she caught herself and stopped, because accepting comfort from a stranger in a situation this uncontrolled was a liability, and she knew it. "The men who came in after you," he said. He wasn't asking a question. He was just opening a door. "They work for someone who wants something I'm not going to give them." And what's that? Me. He studied her the way she studied source texts, looking for what was underneath what was presented. His expression didn't change, and she couldn't read him well enough yet to know what was going on behind it, which unsettled her in a way she was careful not to show. She could read almost anyone. She had built a career on reading people. This one was a locked room. You walked in here, he said, took my hand in front of 60 witnesses, and told the room you're my wife. I know. You do that often? First time, she said. I'm usually better prepared. The corner of his mouth moved. She couldn't tell if it was contempt or something else. The men from the Japanese table, he said. Did you hear what I said to them? She almost said no. The automatic calculation of the interrogation was, he doesn't know she speaks Japanese, revealing that she does hands him information about her. But the calculation beneath that one was faster, and it said, this man already has more power in this room than she does, and lying to him about something he might already suspect was a worse position than strategic honesty. You told them a family matter, that a wife sometimes has needs that come before business. He was quiet for a moment. You speak Japanese, and Korean, and several others. I'm a linguistics professor at UCLA. A linguistics professor from UCLA who runs through the streets of Seoul at 2 a.m. being chased by men with guns. He said it the way you'd describe weather, factual, unhurried. What do they call that at UCLA? A bad semester, she said. This time the corner of his mouth moved more definitely. Not warmth, exactly, but something that had the architecture of it. He leaned back slightly in his chair. She noticed he never fully relaxed. His back never touched the cushion. His hands never went still. There was a constant, low-level readiness in his body, the way a well-maintained machine stays warm even when it's not running. Those two men, he said, meaning the Japanese investors, were about to walk away from a $60 million logistics contract because the man they were dealing with has a reputation. He paused. The kind of reputation that makes international partners nervous. Unstable, they said. Unpredictable. His eyes hadn't moved from her face. Then his wife walked in. Late, apologetic, a little disheveled but clearly educated, clearly from the right kind of life. And suddenly the man looks different. He looks like someone who has something to lose, someone who can be trusted. She understood what he was telling her. She felt the shape of it settle into place with the specific clarity of someone who spent her professional life reconstructing meaning from fragments. You didn't deny it, she said. When I told them I was your wife. No. You let them believe it. I did. And did it work? They extended the meeting by 2 hours and agreed in principle to the full contract. He folded his hands on the table. So you've done something tonight that my negotiating team has been trying to accomplish for 4 months. He said it without gratitude, just as a statement of fact. Which creates a problem. What problem? You know something now that you didn't know 4 minutes ago. About who I am, about what I'm building, about what I need people to believe. He looked at her steadily. That kind of information is dangerous to carry. The warmth she'd almost started to feel in the room dried up fast. She kept her face still. The voice in her head that had kept her alive for 11 days said, stay calm, stay readable enough to seem honest, but opaque enough to seem in control. The other voice, the one that sounded like it had been running on adrenaline for too long and was starting to make mistakes, said, you are sitting across from a man who controls things you don't fully understand, in a city that isn't yours, with no allies and no exit and 2 men outside who will be reporting to Victor Chen by morning. I won't say anything, she said. No, he agreed. You won't. He let that sit. Question is how I make sure of that. The 2 Japanese men were beginning to drift back from the lounge. The server appeared at the edge of her vision. Everything was moving again, the normal pulse of the room resuming, and she understood she had about 45 seconds before he turned back to his business partners, and she became a problem he had already finished solving. You need a wife, she said. He looked at her. Not tonight, she said. Ongoing. Someone who can walk into rooms like this one and make the picture look right. Someone who speaks the languages. Someone who knows how to read what's happening in a negotiation without being told. She steadied her voice. I need protection, and I need money for my mother's cancer treatment. She said it flat. She didn't dress it up. I think we both have something the other person needs, and I think we both know it. And I think you have about 30 seconds before those two men come back and your window closes. He was quiet. She couldn't tell if the stillness was consideration or dismissal. Then the Japanese investors arrived at the edge of the table, bowing slightly, and Kieran Juan stood and greeted them with a composure that suggested he had never in his life made a decision in less than 30 seconds that cost him anything. He gestured to Naomi and said, in Japanese, that this was his wife, that she would be joining them for the remainder of the evening if they had no objection, that she was a professor of linguistics whose expertise spanned East Asian language policy, and that she might in fact have some useful perspective on the regional distribution frameworks they'd been discussing. Both men lit up. She felt his hand land lightly at the small of her back and understood that this was performance, that he had decided that whatever the next 6 months were about to become, they had just begun. She didn't allow herself relief. Relief was a door that swung open only after you knew what was behind it, and she still had no idea what was behind Kieran Juan. 3 hours later, the restaurant had emptied. The investors were gone, phones full of promised follow-ups, shaking both their hands at the door with the specific warmth of men who had just secured something they wanted. The servers had cleared every table but theirs. The low music had been shut off. Somewhere in the back, a kitchen was being cleaned. The only light left was the one directly above them, and in it Kieran Juan sat across from her without his jacket, his sleeves still buttoned, looking at her with an expression that was completely different from the one he'd worn when the investors were present. That one had been curated, deliberate, a version of himself he put on the way she imagined he put on the suit. This one was something else, stripped back, colder. He slid a card across the table. An address. Nothing else. 7 a.m., he said. Not 7:01. She picked up the card. And if I don't show? Then you walk out of here and take your chances with the men outside. He said it without any particular malice, which made it worse. I've already run the name you used at the door to get in. I know who you are. I know who your father is. I know who Victor Chen is. He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. And I know he's already posted people at every hotel you could logically afford. She felt the cold of that settle through her. You had me checked while we were sitting here. I had you checked while you were crossing the room, he said. I had a full report before you sat down. She stared at him. Then why did you let me pitch you? He looked at her for a moment, and she had the strange and disorienting sense of being seen very clearly by someone who was deciding how much of that clarity to let her know about. Because you didn't fold, he said simply. He walked out. Two men who had appeared from somewhere materialized around him the way weather follows its own system. And then the door was closed, and she was alone in an empty restaurant in Seoul with an address on a card and 6 hours until 7 a.m., and outside in the rain, somewhere, men who worked for the person her father had sold her to were still looking. She turned the card over in her hands. Her mother's face surfaced in her mind, thin now, tired, sitting in a hospital chair in Los Angeles that cost money they didn't have. She put the card in her coat pocket. She had one move left, and it led to the address of a man she didn't know, whose business she didn't fully understand, whose stillness scared her in a way that she was only now starting to admit to herself. She stood up. She buttoned her coat. She walked out of the warm restaurant into the cold rain of Seoul, and she told herself she wasn't afraid. She was lying, but she'd gotten good at that, and the night was still young. She found the address at 6:47 in the morning, which meant she'd been standing across the street for 13 minutes, working up the specific kind of nerve that isn't bravery and isn't stupidity, but lives somewhere in the narrow strip between them. The building was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something loud, maybe. Something that announced itself. The physical manifestation of a man whose name made other men go quiet. What she got was a glass tower in Gangnam that looked like every other glass tower in Gangnam. Steel and reflective surface, and a lobby she could see from the street that was staffed by two men in suits who held themselves exactly the way the men outside the restaurant had held themselves the night before. Still. Ready. The posture of people who had learned long ago that visible tension was a liability. She crossed the street at 6:59, 1 minute to spare. She told herself that was intentional. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse without announcing her arrival, which meant someone had already cleared her from the lobby, which meant she had been watched for longer than she was comfortable with. The doors parted on a living space that was large and almost aggressively clean, the kind of clean that isn't domestic but institutional. No personal photographs, no objects on surfaces that existed for anything other than function, a kitchen that looked like it had never processed a meal made by someone who actually lived there. Floor-to-ceiling windows ran the full length of the south wall, and through them souls spread out in the gray morning light, enormous and indifferent. Kieran Juan was standing at those windows with a coffee cup. He didn't turn around when she came in. "You're on time," he said. "I told you I would be. People say a lot of things." He turned then, looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the restaurant. That total, undecorated assessment. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before because she had no others, and she knew how that looked. And she decided not to address it because addressing it would mean she cared. And caring about how she looked in front of this man was a vulnerability she wasn't ready to hand over. "Sit down." There was a table near the kitchen. She sat. A woman appeared from somewhere in the back of the apartment and set down a plate of food and a cup of coffee and disappeared again without making eye contact or saying a word. And Naomi understood that the woman was staff, not personal, and that asking questions about the household logistics right now was the wrong move. She ate. She was hungrier than she'd realized, and she hated that he could probably see that. He sat across from her and set down a folder. He didn't open it. He put his hands flat on the table on either side of it and looked at her the way someone looks at a contract they're about to sign that they're not entirely sure about. "I had my people run full verification on everything you told me last night," he said. "Your mother. The diagnosis, the treatment costs, the insurance gap. Your father's debt to Victor Chen. The transaction." He paused. The nature of that transaction. She kept her face still. "And? Everything checked. I told you it would. You told me a lot of things in about 4 minutes while you were still catching your breath. People in that condition don't always have the best grip on what's true." He opened the folder, pushed one page across to her. "This is what I'm offering." She looked at it. It was a contract, an actual printed contract, 3 pages, and she scanned it fast because she read fast. It was one of the things she'd always been able to do, absorb text at speed, process structure before content. 6 months. Public appearances as his wife when required. Residency in this apartment. A security detail at all times. Monthly payments to her mother's treatment facility beginning within the week. And at the bottom, in language that was precise enough to have been written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A mutual non-disclosure agreement that covered everything about the nature of their arrangement, his business, and everything she might observe or overhear during the term of the contract. She looked up. "This was drafted before you ran verification." He didn't blink. "Yes. You made this decision last night." "I made it when you were still crossing the room." She sat with that for a moment. The idea that she had walked into that restaurant thinking she was acting on instinct while this man had already begun constructing the architecture of what came next before she'd even reached his table. It did something to her equilibrium that she didn't like. "There's nothing in here about what happens if Victor Chen finds me before the 6 months are up," she said. "That's because he won't." "You can't guarantee that." "I just did." He said it without any inflection at all, which was somehow more convincing than if he'd said it with force. Victor Chen operates 3 trafficking corridors through East Asia. 2 of them run through logistics networks that I control. He's been trying to cut me out for 8 months. He needs me to not notice that, which means he needs me to believe we're still operating as partners, which means he will not move directly against anything connected to my name. He folded his hands. "Your name is about to be connected to my name." She pushed the contract back slightly. Not a refusal, just creating space to think. "There's also nothing in here about your business," she said. "What you actually do, what I might be walking into. You don't need to know the details of my business." "I disagree." "Your disagreement is noted." She felt the first real flare of anger. She'd been managing it since the restaurant, keeping it below the surface where it couldn't make her stupid. But it pushed up now with the specific heat of someone who had spent 11 days being managed and moved and decided upon by men who never once asked her what she thought. "Let me be very clear," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm not a prop. I'm not luggage. You want someone who can walk into a room full of executives and make the picture look right. That requires a person with active intelligence, not a mannequin in good shoes. Which means I need to understand enough about what you do to not say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. Brigitte Mashmak is so silent, she paused. Unless you'd like to explain to your Japanese investors why your wife doesn't know what industry her husband works in. Intui Ashol. The silence lasted long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated. Then something shifted in his expression. Not softening, nothing that soft, but a kind of recalibration. Logistics, he said. Shipping. Transportation networks across Korea, Japan, and the South China Sea corridor. Some of it operates in gray areas. Some of it operates in areas that are further from gray than that. He said it the way someone describes the weather when they are the weather. You don't need the specifics. You need to know that the people we'll be sitting across from are powerful, that they are accustomed to being read accurately, and that if you perform as well as you did last night, none of them will look past the surface. And the surface is happily married, stable, the kind of man you give $60 million to. Yes. She looked at the contract again, her mother's face again, unavoidable now, the image surfacing with the specific cruelty of things you are trying not to think about. Stage 3. The oncologist had used words like aggressive and window and time-sensitive with the practiced gentleness of someone who had learned to deliver bad news without flinching, which made it worse somehow, the absence of flinching. I have conditions, she said. You don't. I have conditions, she said again. Same register, no louder, and he stopped. My mother's treatment payments are guaranteed regardless of whether this arrangement ends early, not contingent on 6 months, not contingent on performance. If you pull me out of this in 2 weeks because you changed your mind, those payments continue for the full duration of her treatment. She held his eyes. Second, I have access to communication with my mother and Daniel Park at all times. Supervised if you need it to be, but not blocked. She pushed the contract back across the table. Third, no one on your team touches me without my consent. Not for the performance, not for anything. I don't care how it looks. He looked at the contract. He looked at her. Anything else? Yes. I want to know the name of whoever is on my security detail, and I want to be able to talk to them directly, not through intermediaries. She picked up the coffee cup. That's it. Another silence. Longer this time. The third condition is already in the contract, he said. Page 2, paragraph 4. She hadn't gotten that far. She kept her face neutral. The others I'll add, he said. He picked up the folder. My assistant will have revised copies ready within the hour. He stood. In the meantime, there's a room at the end of the hall. Clothes were ordered this morning in your size. I'll need you ready by noon. There's a lunch with the head of a shipping association and his wife. You'll sit next to her. She speaks Korean and English. Talk to her about anything except business. He was already moving toward the hallway. And Professor Ellis. She looked up. Welcome to my house, he said. Don't touch anything on the desk in the study. Then he was gone, and she was alone in an apartment that wasn't hers, in a city where men were looking for her, sitting across from an empty coffee cup and a contract that was about to restructure what was left of her life. She turned to page 2. Found paragraph 4. Read it. It said exactly what he told her it said. She didn't know why that surprised her. She filed it away with everything else she was collecting about Kieran Hwan and went to find the room at the end of the hall. The first week was a study in sustained discomfort, not the dramatic, cinematic kind of discomfort where everything is confrontation and raised voices. The quiet, grinding, close quarters kind that comes from sharing space with someone you don't know and can't fully read, where every small domestic moment, breakfast timing, bathroom use, the volume of ambient noise in a room becomes a negotiation conducted entirely through body language and deliberate absence. Kieran Hwan, she learned, woke at 5. He ran for 40 minutes on the building's private track. He was showered and dressed by 6:30 in suits that cost more than her monthly salary and sitting at the desk in the study, the desk she wasn't to touch, by 7, and whatever he did at that desk for the next 3 hours was done in total silence. No music, no phone calls she could hear. Just the occasional low exchange in Korean with whichever of the 2 men who rotated through the apartment on 12-hour shifts was currently stationed near the door. His name was Min, the one on the day shift, He was maybe 25, compact and watchful, and when Naomi asked him on the second morning if he wanted coffee, he looked at her like she'd suggested something deeply inappropriate and said, "No, thank you," in a tone that closed the conversation with the efficiency of a door being locked. The other one was older, Seo. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and he never made eye contact with her directly. But she noticed he tracked her movement throughout the apartment, the way someone tracks a variable they haven't classified yet. Not hostile, not friendly, just watchful in the way of a man who had learned that the things that hurt you were usually the things you stopped watching. She adapted, because adaptation was what she did, what she had always done. What you learned to do when you grew up in a household where the temperature of a room could change without warning based on her father's mood or his finances, or some combination of the two that nobody ever explained to her. She mapped the apartment. She identified the rhythms. She figured out that Kieran ate lunch alone and dinner rarely, that he was on the phone in a language she could only partially identify as a regional Korean dialect between 9 and 10 every evening, that he never watched television but read in the sitting room sometimes until late, and that whatever he was reading was always held at an angle she couldn't see from the hallway. She wasn't trying to surveil him. She was trying to understand the environment she was living in, which was a distinction she kept making to herself with decreasing conviction the more she noted. The public appearances were easier than she expected, which surprised her, and then it didn't. The lunch on the first day, a diplomatic dinner on the fourth, a gallery opening on the sixth where 3 different people she'd never met greeted her by name and seemed genuinely pleased she was there, which meant Kieran had seeded her existence into his social world before she arrived, which meant he was better at this than she'd given him credit for. In public, the performance was seamless in a way that required almost nothing from her. He didn't overperform. He didn't touch her more than the situation demanded. A hand at her back, briefly, when entering a room. A glance across a table at the right moment that read, to anyone watching, as the specific kind of marital shorthand that develops over years. He was good at it, so good that on the evening of the 4th day she found herself analyzing the performance objectively and realized that he had probably done something like this before, which opened a question she decided not to ask yet. In private, they barely spoke. It was the shipment coordinator on day 8 who cracked the surface. She had been in the sitting room going through a stack of academic journals she'd had Daniel Park collect from a university library. She needed to stay functional, needed to keep her mind doing what her mind did, or she would begin to calcify. When she overheard a conversation through the study door that she understood should not have been audible. Kieran's voice, low and controlled. Another voice, rough, apologetic, the specific tone of someone who is trying to contain the information they're delivering. She caught words in the regional Korean she was still calibrating: shipment, timing, third party, exposure. Then Kieran's voice, 5 words, quiet enough that she had to strain. Who else knows about this? A pause. An answer she couldn't catch. Then silence. Just nothing. No response. Which was worse than any response she could imagine. She looked down at her journal. She turned a page she hadn't read. 20 minutes later, the study door opened and Kieran came out and stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize. How much did you hear? No point in pretending. Enough to know something went wrong with the shipment. He studied her. What else? That you're not happy about someone knowing something they weren't supposed to know. She met his eyes. I wasn't trying to listen. But you did. The door isn't soundproof. His jaw moved slightly. Not speaking. Processing. What I discussed in that room stays in that room. I know. I mean it, Professor. I know, she said again. Same register, no flinching. I'm not going to say anything. Not because you're threatening me, but because I'm not stupid and I understand what side of the line I'm standing on. She turned another page. And because you've kept your end of the contract. My mother's first payment cleared 3 days ago. He looked at her for another moment. Then he went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood there drinking it with his back to her, and she could see the tension in the lines of his shoulders from across the room. The specific kind of tension that isn't about anger, but about the weight of something being held together by effort alone. She shouldn't have said the next thing. She knew she shouldn't, even as she was saying it. You're carrying too much by yourself, she said, Whatever is going wrong, you're trying to hold every piece of it and not let anyone see the weight. He turned around. The look he gave her was not warm. It was the opposite of warm. It was the look of someone who has been unexpectedly exposed and doesn't know yet whether to be angry or careful. "Don't do that," he said. "Do what?" "That." He set the glass down. "The reading. Whatever it is you do, keep it for the people across the table. It doesn't belong in this apartment." She held his gaze. "All right." He went back to the study. The door didn't close all the way this time. She sat with that for a long time. The fight that broke the first 2 weeks of cold, polite coexistence happened on a Tuesday and started over something small the way the worst fights always do. She had made a change to the cover story. A small one. During a lunch with the wife of a shipping executive, a sharp, socially aggressive woman named Jung Yeon, who had been probing the timeline of their relationship with the specific skill of someone who considers other people's marriages fair game for inspection, Naomi had shifted one detail. Instead of the story they'd rehearsed that she and Kieran had met at a business conference in Tokyo, she had said they met in New York, because Jung Yeon had been in Tokyo that year, had attended that conference, and had started describing it with the particular pleasure of someone about to catch a lie. She had handled it. The lunch had gone fine. Jung Yeon had left satisfied. Kieran found out by that evening. She heard him come into the apartment, heard the specific quality of the silence that followed, and knew before he came into the sitting room that something had been reported back. "New York," he said. "Tokyo was going to collapse," she said. She set down the journal. Jung Yeon was there. "I know she was there. That's why the Tokyo story was chosen, because she couldn't ask you for specifics about a conference you theoretically both attended without admitting she didn't remember you." Naomi stared at him. "That's—" She stopped. "That's actually not a bad play." "No, it isn't." His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something with edges. "You changed the story without telling me. I made a judgment call in the moment." In the moment. He moved further into the room. "Do you understand what a story change does? Jung Yeon is going to mention New York to someone. That someone has a version in their head that says Tokyo. Those two things don't match, and then someone starts asking questions." "I understand that," she said. And she did, and the fact that she did made the next part harder. "I made the call I thought was right. You made the call you wanted to make. Without telling me. Without checking." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the line of his jaw, the controlled restraint in his expression. "That is not how this works." "Then tell me how it works," she said. "Because from where I'm standing, I'm the one in the room reading the people in real time, and you're not always there to ask. Then you wait." "I can't always wait." "Then you deflect. You don't rewrite the architecture." "I deflected what I could and rewrote what I had to," she said. "The lunch didn't collapse. The relationship with Jung Yeon is intact. I did the job. You did it your way. My way worked." He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel the shape of the argument pressing against the room, could feel both of them deciding whether to push further or let it settle, and she realized she was breathing faster than she wanted to be, and that annoyed her. "The cover story doesn't change without my approval," he said finally. "That's not negotiable." "Fine," she said. "Then make yourself available for approval, or trust the person you hired to do this." He opened his mouth, closed it. She watched something move through his expression that wasn't anger anymore, something more complicated. The specific emotion of someone who is being told a thing they know is true by someone they're not ready to admit is right. "New York," he said again, quieter this time. Not accusation, just processing it. "We met at a gallery opening in Chelsea," she said. "You were there for business. I was presenting at a language policy conference uptown. It was November. It rained." She said it steadily. "I can make it real enough that you'll believe it. That's what I do." He looked at her. Something shifted in the room, subtle, the way air pressure changes before a storm moves through. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she said. He turned to go. "Kieran." It was the first time she'd used his first name. She felt him register it, a slight pause in the turn, nothing visible, just a fraction of a second more than the movement required. The man you were talking to on day 8, the one on the phone about the shipment. She kept her voice level. If something is about to compromise our cover, I need to know, not the details. Just, am I about to be walked into a room where people know something is wrong? He stood with his back still half turned to her. Nothing is going to compromise the cover, he said. That's not an answer. He turned all the way around then, and the look he gave her was different from any look he'd given her before. Not assessment, not controlled. Something that lived closer to the surface than he usually allowed. And she understood without being told that she was seeing something very few people got to see, which was Kieran Hwan standing inside a situation he wasn't completely in control of and knowing it. There's a man in my organization, he said slowly, who has been providing information to Victor Chen. He said it like each word cost something. I don't know who yet. The room went very quiet. How long have you known there was a leak? She said. 8 days. 8 days. Since before she arrived, which meant everything he had done since she walked into that restaurant, the contract, the cover story, the public appearances, the careful management of information inside his own apartment, had been happening while he was sitting on the knowledge that someone inside his organization was feeding intelligence to the man who wanted to own her. Victor knows I'm here, she said. Not a question. His silence was an answer. He knows I'm using you as cover, she said. He knows you're connected to my name. He doesn't know the arrangement. He paused. Yet. The yet sat in the room like a lit fuse. She stood up slowly. Her legs were steady. Her voice, when it came, was steady. She had learned a long time ago in rooms far less dangerous than this one that the body follows the performance if you commit to it hard enough. Then we have a problem, she said, and it isn't Jung-yeon, and it isn't the cover story. She met his eyes. Someone in your house is going to hand me to Victor Chen, and we're both standing here pretending the bigger issue is that I changed a detail at a lunch. He held her gaze, and for the first time since she'd grabbed his hand in that restaurant, the mask of absolute control slipped just far enough that she could see the thing underneath it. Not weakness, nothing that soft, but the very human and very specific weight of a man who has been carrying too many threats at once and is beginning to feel the accumulated load of them in his bones. I'm handling it, he said. Handle it faster, she said. And somewhere in the building below them, in the lobby or the parking structure or the street outside, a man whose name neither of them yet knew was picking up a phone to make a call he had been paid to make. And the call lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Naomi knew this because she counted. Not intentionally. She was standing in the kitchen with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, listening to the specific quality of silence that had settled over the apartment after their conversation, and her mind defaulted to what it always defaulted to when she was afraid, which was measurement. Quantifying the unquantifiable, giving numbers to things that didn't have them, because numbers implied structure, and structure implied control, and control was the thing she was most desperately lacking right now. Kieran had gone back into the study. She heard the door click. She heard, low and distant, his voice begin, and then nothing for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. And then the door opened again, and he came out and looked at her across the length of the apartment with an expression that told her something had changed, and not in a direction that was going to make the next conversation easy. Get your coat, he said. Where are we going? Somewhere that isn't here. She got her coat. She didn't ask again. Min was waiting at the elevator with the specific readiness of someone who had been told to be ready before he was told why, which meant Kieran had messaged him during the call, which meant Kieran had been moving pieces before he'd finished talking to her, which meant whatever he'd learned in those 4 minutes and 32 seconds was bad enough to mobilize before processing. The car was in the basement. Another man she hadn't seen before was behind the wheel. They pulled out into Seoul traffic at 9:43 p.m. and drove without direction, which she recognized after the first 2 turns as a counter-surveillance pattern. No destination, just movement, changing variables, making a tail impossible to maintain. She'd read about it. She had never experienced it from inside the car. She sat in the back seat next to Kieran, and he looked out the window and she looked at the side of his face and waited. The man in my organization, he said finally to the window, who has been feeding information to Victor Chen. He paused. His name is Rio. She waited. He's been with me for 6 years, he said. He was with my father before that. She understood then why the pause had been as long as it was. How sure are you? She said. The communication pattern was traced to a device registered in his name. The financial transfer came from an account 2 steps removed from a shell company Victor Chen has used before. He said it with the flat precision of someone reading a report they don't want to believe. My people spent 8 days being careful. They're sure. Where is he now? That's the problem. He turned from the window. He's gone. Left the building 4 hours ago. Didn't sign out. His apartment is empty. He looked at her directly. He took something with him. She felt the cold of it before he said it. He took the folder, Kieran said. The one my legal team prepared for the immigration filing. Your real documentation. Your name, your background, the university records, the medical files for your mother. His jaw was tight. Everything we used to establish your identity here. The glass of water she hadn't drunk was still in her mind, the specific weight of it, the way cold transfers through glass into skin, and she focused on that sensation as a way of not letting what he was saying fully land in the place where things land and become real. Victor has my real identity, she said. He will within the hour if he doesn't already. And the immigration authorities will receive an anonymous tip by morning, Kieran said, probably with documentation suggesting our marriage is fraudulent, probably with enough specifics to open a formal investigation. He turned back to the window. Rio knew enough to make it convincing. She sat with it. Outside the car, Seoul continued in total indifference. Neon and pedestrians, and the ordinary noise of a city that had no idea and no interest in what was happening in the back of this car. She had a sudden and irrational feeling of envy for everyone on those sidewalks. All those people going home. How long do we have before the immigration office moves? She said. My contact there says 24 hours. Maybe 36 if the filing gets delayed in processing. He said it without softening. After that, they'll come to the apartment. And if they find nothing, they'll find a woman with a documented fake identity living in my home, he said, which is what we are, which is exactly what Rio gave them. The car made another turn. The driver hadn't spoken once. She breathed. She let the breath out slowly and did the things she'd learned to do in the years of managing her father's chaos, which was to locate the one true thing in the room and stand on it, because panic was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford it. There is one solution, she said. I know, he said. A legal marriage can't be fraudulent, she said. If the documentation exists and it's real and it predates the investigation, I know, he said. You'd have to file within 18 hours to create a clear Naomi. He said her name the way he said most things, without decoration, without gentleness, just direct. But there was something in it this time that was different from every other time he'd used it. I know. The car went around another block. The driver's eyes stayed forward. Is that something you're willing to do? She said. He was quiet for long enough that she started building contingencies in her head, alternate routes, other possibilities, the architecture of escape from a situation that was tightening in every direction. Then he said, Is it something you're willing to do? She thought about her mother. She thought about the payments that were already processing, the treatment facility in Los Angeles that had called 2 days ago to confirm the first installment. She thought about the men who had chased her through the rain and the folder that now contained everything needed to find her, handed over by a man who'd known Kieran Juan for 6 years and betrayed him anyway for reasons she didn't yet know and suspected were worse than money. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Then we need to move fast. They moved fast. The next 14 hours were the most technically demanding of her life, which was a sentence she would have laughed at 6 weeks ago when the most technically demanding days of her life involved grant applications and faculty committee hearings. Kieran's legal team was pulled from their homes at midnight and assembled in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building downtown that had no sign on the door and staff who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had handled urgent situations before and expected to handle them again. She sat across from a lawyer named Han who was precise and sleepless and clearly very good at his job, and answered every question about her actual identity with the documents Kieran's team had reconstructed from secondary sources, university records, medical records, digital footprints that Rio hadn't been able to take because they existed in systems rather than folders. Kieran sat beside her throughout. He didn't speak unless Han directed a question at him. He kept his hands flat on the table. She was aware of him the entire time in the specific way you are aware of something load-bearing, not because it demands your attention, but because it is the thing the structure depends on. At 4 in the morning, Han set down his pen and said, "The filing can be ready by 6. It will be legal. It will be real." He looked at both of them. "But it will also be permanent in the ways that matter. An actual marriage creates actual legal obligations that a contract cannot override. I want both of you to understand that before you sign." Kieran looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them looked away. "We understand," Kieran said. She signed her name at 6:14 in the morning. Her handwriting was steady. She was proud of that, in a small, cold way. He signed beside her. She noticed he didn't hesitate, which meant he had already settled it somewhere inside himself before the pen touched the paper, the same way he had apparently already settled everything else before she knew it was being decided. Han gathered the documents. "I'll file when the office opens at 8, he said. "You'll have confirmation by 10. He left. The room emptied. The lawyers and their assistants filtered out with the efficiency of a tide. And then it was just the two of them in the fluorescent light of the conference room at 6 in the morning, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul was just beginning to turn the specific gray-pink of very early dawn. She said, "I need to call my mother." "I know," he said. "You can use the secure line in the next room." She stood. She was halfway to the door when she stopped, because something had arrived in her chest that she wasn't expecting and didn't have an immediate strategy for. The compressed, pressurized sensation of everything she had not allowed herself to feel for the last 6 weeks arriving all at once, stacked up behind the wall she'd built, leaning against it now with the weight of the whole accumulation. She didn't turn around. She didn't want him to see her face. "Thank you," she said. To the door, to the room. She wasn't sure. Behind her, a silence, then, "Don't thank me yet." She almost laughed. It came out wrong, something shorter, more ragged than a laugh. She walked out of the room. The immigration officers came at 11:15. 2 of them. A man and a woman, both in the specific neutral professional dress of government authority, both carrying the polite and implacable manner of people who have been trained to be immune to the emotional temperature of the rooms they enter. They sat in the apartment's main room across from Naomi and Kieran and asked questions for 90 minutes. "How long have you been together?" 3 years. Where did you meet?" "New York, Chelsea, November, a gallery opening." "What was the name of the gallery?" "The Meridian." "What were you wearing?" She answered that one with a specificity that made the female officer's pen slow slightly on her notepad. A dark green dress, low heels, the small gold earrings her mother had given her when she finished her first doctorate. Because she had learned from a conference 2 weeks ago that Jung-yeon had mentioned New York to someone who mentioned it to someone else. And Naomi had spent 3 days building the texture of that night until it felt as real as any memory she actually had. "Where does your husband keep his reading glasses?" "He doesn't wear them yet, but he holds documents at arm's length when he's tired, which she'd noticed on day 4 and filed without knowing she was filing it." "What does he eat for breakfast?" "Coffee. Nothing else until noon, and then whatever is fastest." "What side of the bed does he sleep on?" "Left." She knew this because the left side of his bed showed the subtle impression of consistent use, and the right side was pristine, a detail she'd registered without meaning to during the one time she'd had reason to walk through his room. Kieran answered his questions with the same unhurried control he brought to every room. When they asked him what she was like when she was angry, he looked at her briefly, and something moved through his expression that was so close to affection that she almost lost the thread of what she was supposed to be feeling. "She gets very still," he said, "like she's conserving energy. And then she says exactly the thing you least want to hear." The female officer looked at Naomi. Naomi looked at Kieran. "That's accurate," she said. The officers exchanged a look, not the look of people who had confirmed a fraud, the other kind. They left at 12:45. Han called at 1:10 to confirm the marriage registration had cleared. The investigation was formally closed at 1:57. She was in the kitchen when Kieran came to tell her. She was making tea, which she'd been doing because she needed something to do with her hands, because the adrenaline of the morning had nowhere else to go, and her hands without a task became a liability. "It's done," he said. "I heard." She turned. What happens now? Now we go back to the arrangement. He leaned in the doorway. He'd taken off his jacket. She realized she'd never seen him without the jacket in daylight hours before. The original timeline still applies. 6 months, end of the contract. The contract that now has a marriage certificate attached to it, she said. Yes. She turned back to the kettle. You said Rio was with you for 6 years. A pause. Yes. Why did he do it? She heard the question come out quieter than she intended, less academic, more human. Was it money? Partly. He was quiet for a moment. Victor Chen had information about a member of Rio's family, someone Rio was trying to protect. Another pause. He thought he could give Victor enough to keep that person safe without actually doing serious damage. She thought about that, the specific, horrible logic of it, the bargaining that happens when you're trying to protect someone you love with the only currency you have. Did it work? She said. For the family member. No, Kieran said. Victor used the information anyway, and then he used Rio anyway. He said it without inflection, which was somehow the most devastating way to say it. That's what Victor does. He takes what you offer, and he takes the rest. She stood with that. The kettle began to make noise. Is Rio... She started. Alive, Kieran said. My people found him this morning. He's... A pause of a different quality. Being dealt with. She didn't ask what that meant. She made a decision not to ask what that meant, filed it in the category of things she had chosen to be selectively blind about, because everyone in this world she'd walked into had their own version of that category, and hers was allowed to exist too. She poured the tea. She made 2 cups without deciding to. She turned and held one out toward him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took it, and they stood at opposite ends of the counter in silence. And outside the window, Seoul went about its enormous ordinary business. And for a moment, the apartment felt less like a tactical position and more like a place 2 people were inhabiting at the same time, which was not the same thing as home, but was closer than either of them had been in a while. It lasted about 40 seconds before his phone went off. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not the way a face changes when it wants you to see the change. The subtle kind, the kind she'd learned to watch for. What? She said. He turned the phone toward her. A news alert. She read the headline and felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the building moving. American woman linked to Korean crime network. Sources reveal identity of mystery wife. Below it, her photograph. Not a recent one, her faculty headshot from the UCLA website, professional, the one she'd always thought made her look slightly more authoritative than she felt. Her name. Her father's name. A summary of Robert Ellis's diplomatic career and the debts attached to it. And at the bottom, a quote from an anonymous source describing her escape from the United States as flight from a criminal investigation rather than flight toward safety. Someone had not only given her identity to Victor Chen, they had given it to the press. That's not Rio, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled. She could feel the flatness of it from the outside, which meant she was performing control, which meant she did not actually have it. No, Kieran said. Rio didn't have media contacts. Then there's another one. She set down the tea. There's someone else. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She looked at the photograph on his phone. Her own face, looking back at her from a context she'd never imagined for it. Attached to a story that would reach every immigration office, every law enforcement database, every contact Victor Chen had in every city that mattered. The article had a timestamp. 40 minutes ago. It was already being picked up. She could see the share count climbing in real time at the bottom of the screen. How many people, she said, know the real nature of this arrangement? He was quiet. Kieran. She said his name the way you say something when you need the person to understand that the next answer is the one that decides everything. How many people know this marriage is a contract? 3, he said. Han, Mint, and one other. She looked at him. Who is the one other? The silence that followed was the longest silence she had experienced in the entire time she had known him, and she had experienced some significant silences, and the length of this one told her the answer was something that was going to cost them both more than the press article had. He said a name she didn't recognize. Then he told her who it was. She had to sit down. The chair was behind her and she found it without looking because her legs had made a decision independent of her. And she sat in it and looked at the table and processed what he had just told her with the specific, focused methodology of someone who has been trained to decode the most complex possible structures of meaning and is now applying that training to the worst possible information. The person who knew, the one beyond Han and Min, was not an employee, was not a subordinate, was not someone Kieran had chosen to trust. It was someone who had been there from the beginning, someone whose presence in Kieran's life was so structural, so foundational, that he had not even considered them as a variable. The way you don't consider gravity as a variable. It's just the condition under which everything else operates. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and it took her a moment to identify it because it was so out of place on him, on the particular geography of his face, which had until now expressed only control in its various temperatures. What she saw was something that looked like grief. "You didn't think they would," she said. Not accusation, just locating the truth of it. "No," he said, "but they did." "Yes." She stood back up because sitting felt like surrender. And she was not ready to surrender. Not to this. Not to the accumulated weight of betrayals that seemed to have no floor, each one revealing another below it, the floor dropping out again and again. She stood, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she breathed. Once, twice, the specific deliberate breathing of someone who is refusing to let the room win. "Victor is going to move now," she said. "The press article buys him cover. He can claim he's just responding to news. He can mobilize openly." She looked at Kieran. "How much time do we have before he does something physical?" "Hours," Kieran said. "Maybe less." "Then we need to stop reacting," she said. "We've been reacting since Rio. We need to move first." He looked at her. The grief was still there, but something was moving alongside it now, the machinery of him engaging, the part that had built what he'd built and held it and survived in environments she was only beginning to understand. "What are you thinking?" he said. She was thinking about Victor Chen, about the trafficking corridors Kieran had mentioned, the logistics networks, the way power like Victor's was constructed, not from strength but from information, from knowing things other people didn't know, from controlling the flow of knowledge the way you control the flow of water, by owning the infrastructure it moves through. She was also thinking about 7 languages and a doctorate in linguistics, and 14 years of reading the subtext beneath the text, the meaning beneath the meaning, the thing people were actually saying when they said the thing they were saying. And she was thinking about the intercepted communications that Kieran's people had been monitoring, the encoded messages they'd flagged but not fully decoded, the regional dialects and maritime shipping terminology, and layered references that his analysts had been working on for weeks without resolution. "I need access to everything your team has intercepted from Victor's network," she said. "Every communication, every fragment." She straightened. "Because I think he's been talking in a language your people don't fully speak, and I think I do." Kieran looked at her for a long moment. "If you're wrong," he said, "we lose the only intelligence advantage we have left." "I know," she said. "I'm not wrong." He held her gaze. She held his. Outside the window, the city was moving through its afternoon as if nothing was ending and nothing was beginning, as if 2 people in an apartment weren't standing at the exact edge of the point where everything that came before stops mattering and what comes next is the only thing left. "All right," he said. She nodded. She moved toward the study, the room she wasn't supposed to touch anything in, the room she had been careful about, deferential about, for 6 weeks, and pushed the door open and walked in, and Kieran Juan followed her into his own study without saying a word about it. And that silence felt like the first real thing that had happened between them since the night she'd grabbed his hand in the rain. She sat at the desk. He sat beside her. He opened the encrypted files on the secondary monitor and turned it toward her, and she looked at the first intercepted communication. Scrambled, layered, a dense block of text that her analysts had tagged as unresolvable. And she started to read. And somewhere in the city, Victor Chen was making his own plans. And the clock that had been running since the night she ran into that restaurant was running faster now, the seconds smaller, the margin for error no longer measurable in days or hours, but in the distance between what she could decode and what it was already too late to stop. She worked for 6 hours without stopping. Not 6 hours in the way that academics work, moving between coffee and distraction and the comfortable drift of intellectual exploration. 6 hours with her spine rigid and her eyes burning, and the kind of focused intensity that comes when the alternative to solving the problem in front of you is measurable in body bags. Kieran's secondary monitor threw blue light across her face. She didn't notice. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere inside the architecture of the communications his team had flagged and failed to parse. And she was finding the structure of it the way she found the structure of everything, by listening for what wasn't being said. Victor Chen's network communicated in a layered system that his analysts had been treating as encryption. It wasn't. It was dialect. A specific blend of coastal Fujian Chinese, maritime trading terminology from pre-standardization Taiwanese shipping culture, and a grammatical inversion pattern she had documented in a 2019 paper on minority language preservation in South China Sea trading communities. It wasn't a code. It was a language. And the reason his analysts hadn't broken it was because you couldn't break a language by running it through a decryption algorithm. You had to have lived near enough to it to recognize the bones of it when it was dressed in different skin. She had spent 4 months in Fujian province in 2018 conducting field research. She had eaten in those fishing villages and recorded those dialects and sat with elderly traders who spoke a version of Mandarin that mainstream linguists had stopped documenting a generation ago. She had written a paper that 12 people had read and 3 had cited. It turned out that paper was the most operationally valuable thing she had ever produced. "Here," she said. Her voice came out rough. She hadn't spoken in 2 hours. She pointed at the screen. Kieran was beside her, had been beside her for most of the 6 hours, close enough that she was constantly aware of him the way you're aware of a heat source in a cold room. This phrase, your people flagged it as unknown terminology. It's not. It's a delivery confirmation format used in pre-container era maritime trading. The number that follows isn't a quantity. It's a birth designation. Kieran leaned in. His shoulder was almost touching hers. Which berth? Incheon, Container Terminal 3. She pulled up the next flagged communication, cross-referenced it against the timestamp. This one from 4 days ago. They were confirming a staging timeline. The phrase here means roughly, before the tide turns twice, which in the original trading context meant within 48 hours of the communication. 4 days ago plus 48 hours, he said. Was 2 days ago, she said, but this one, she scrolled to the most recent intercept timestamp that morning, before the press article, before the world had started moving. This one uses a different construction. It means on the agreed night, which is a fixed reference, not relative. What night? That's what I've been trying to establish. She pulled up 3 more documents simultaneously, the kind of parallel processing that had gotten her through 2 doctorates and was now keeping 2 people alive, and cross-referenced the maritime terms against a sailing almanac she'd found in Kieran's study bookshelf, the only genuinely personal object she'd found in the entire apartment, worn at the spine and annotated in a handwriting that was smaller and more careful than his current one, which meant it had belonged to someone else first. Tonight, she said. The tide reference, the moon phase mentioned in the earlier communication, and the logistics window. It's tonight. Silence. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been learning. The one that meant he was ahead of the conversation, that he had already gone somewhere she was still catching up to. He's not just moving a shipment, she said. No. He's using the shipment as cover. She heard her own voice arriving at the conclusion a half-second behind her brain. The terminal, the staging, he's moving people. Yes, and he wants to be done before the investigation he triggered with the press article gives authorities a reason to start looking at his logistics. She was breathing faster. She made herself slow it. He timed the leak to create noise, political noise, immigration noise, attention on you and on me, while he moves the thing he actually cares about through a terminal that your people control. Used to control, Kieran said. Rio's leak included our terminal access protocols. She stared at him. He handed over the access codes. Not directly, but enough that Victor's people could reconstruct them. He stood, moved away from the desk, the motion of a man whose body needed to be in motion when his mind was operating at this speed. Victor has been planning this for months. The press article, Rio, the immigration filing, Sutsi, none of it was improvised. He built it all to converge tonight. He needed you occupied, she said, dealing with the fallout, while he used our own terminal infrastructure to move his operation. He stopped, turned. If we go to the authorities now, the investigation triggered by the press article makes everything you tell them look like deflection, she said. You're a criminal organization under scrutiny. They won't move fast enough even if they believe you. Which means we move ourselves. She heard it in his voice, not recklessness, not the hot-headed escalation of someone who hadn't thought it through. The specific, cold resolve of someone who had been waiting for the moment when all variables were known and action became the only remaining calculation. How many people do you have? She said. Enough. He was already on the phone before she finished the sentence, speaking in Korean too fast for her to catch more than the shape of it. Logistics, deployment, a terminal address, a time. He hung up. We leave in 20 minutes. I'm coming, she said. He looked at her. No. The communications, you've decoded them. I have what I need. Victor has people who speak Fujian dialect, she said. Your people don't. If there's anything else that needs to be read in real time, she held his eyes. You need me there. The 20 seconds that followed were some of the longest she'd sat through in a life that had recently set a high bar for long seconds. Stay behind the perimeter, he said. You do not move without men. Do you understand me? Yes. Say it. I stay behind the perimeter. I don't move without men. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he moved, and she moved, and the apartment that had been her world for 6 weeks became a place she was leaving, possibly for the last time. And she didn't let herself look back at it. The Incheon container terminal at 11 p.m. was its own kind of world, massive and industrial and lit in the specific brutal orange of sodium vapor lights that turned everything the color of rust. Rows of shipping containers stacked 6 high, stretching further than the eye could organize into coherent distance. The smell of salt water and diesel and the particular cold of a coastal wind that had been building momentum over open water before it hit land. The terminal was officially closed for the night, which meant the dozen workers she could see moving between containers were not dock workers. Kieran's cars came in through a service entrance on the north side, lights off for the last quarter mile. 8 vehicles. She counted the people who got out and stopped counting at 30, because the point wasn't the number, but what the number meant. And what it meant was that Kieran Hwan had spent 6 weeks appearing to manage a public relations crisis while simultaneously positioning every resource he had for exactly this. She stood with Min behind a secondary vehicle, 40 meters from the main formation. Min was not happy about her being there. He communicated this not through words, but through the specific quality of his silence and the way he kept positioning himself between her and the open ground ahead. A human barrier that was simultaneously protective and insulting, and she chose not to address either. Her earpiece crackled. Kieran's voice, flat and quiet. Alpha Team, Northwest Corridor, Beta. Hold East Access. Nobody moves until I have eyes on the cargo. She heard the word cargo and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't about logistics. The cargo wasn't product. The cargo was people. She didn't know how many. She knew from the communication she'd decoded that the operation had been running for weeks, feeding into Victor's expansion across the Japanese and Korean channels. And the number she'd extrapolated from the staging references was large enough that the tightening in her chest had been there for the last 3 hours and wasn't going anywhere. Movement in the middle distance. She saw it before Min did. Figures between 2 container rows, more than the dock configuration required, moving with the shuffling, uncertain gait of people who are not moving voluntarily. She grabbed Min's arm and pointed. He was already on comms. Contact Sector 7, moving east. Then everything happened very fast. The terminal exploded into controlled chaos. Kieran's people moving through the container rows with the practiced speed of people who had done this before. Shouts in Korean, and then return shouts from the other direction. Someone hitting a light array that hadn't been on the official manifest, and flooding the east section in white halogen that threw everything into hard-edged relief. She heard what might have been one gunshot, flat and percussive in the open air, and then voices raised above the level of control, the specific escalating sound of a confrontation going non-linear. Min grabbed her arm. Back in the car. I can hear what they're saying. Back in the... A man came around the rear of their vehicle at a speed that meant he wasn't one of Kieran's, and Min had about a quarter second of warning before contact, which was enough for him but only barely. She saw the collision rather than processing it in real time. Min rotating, weight shifting, the other man going down but not cleanly, both of them on the ground, and the specific ugly sound of people fighting without rules or restraint. And she stood there for the 2 seconds it took her brain to stop being a spectator and start being an asset. She moved, not away. She'd watched Kieran train with his people every morning for 6 weeks, had observed from doorways she pretended not to be standing in, and she had a doctorate in pattern recognition, even if the patterns she usually recognized were phonological rather than physical. The man on the ground with Min had one functional advantage: size, and one critical vulnerability, which was that he was focused entirely on Min and his back was to her. She didn't do anything cinematic. She grabbed a steel flashlight from the door pocket of the car, crossed the distance in 3 steps, and hit him across the back of the knee with everything she had, which wasn't much but was enough. His leg buckled, his weight redistributed, and Min, who did not need a second opportunity, had him down and controlled in under 4 seconds. She stood there breathing. Her hands were shaking. She noticed them shaking and decided to deal with that later. Min looked up at her from the ground. His expression was something she didn't have a category for. "You hit him with a flashlight," he said. "Yes." "Where did you—" "You were busy," she said. "Can we—" Her earpiece crackled. Kieran's voice, different now, tighter. "Naomi, I need you in Sector 7, now." Sector 7 was a container space that had been converted. She understood it when she saw it, and then wished she didn't. 3 40-foot containers arranged in a U configuration, vents cut in the top, a generator running external air circulation, and inside, people, mostly women. Some younger than she was comfortable calculating. 40, maybe 50, sitting or standing in the specific dazed stillness of people who have been moved too many times in too short a period to have anything left that functions as hope. 2 of Victor's men were in the configuration, and Kieran had both of them controlled before she arrived, which meant her role in the immediate physical situation was 0. What was needed was something else. One woman near the back was talking. Fast, low, the kind of speech that comes from the edge of shock, not making eye contact with anyone, talking to the air in front of her, and the language she was talking in was the coastal Fujian dialect, and the words she was saying were a name, repeated, a child's name, in the specific rhythm of someone who has been saying a name long enough that it has stopped being communication and started being the thing keeping them tethered. Naomi walked to her. She crouched down to eye level, which was the first thing she'd learned in her fieldwork. "You do not stand above someone you are trying to reach," she said, in the dialect, not perfectly but close enough. "I hear you. What is her name?" The woman stopped, looked at her. The specific quality of that look, the shock of being heard in a language you had stopped expecting to be understood, was something Naomi had witnessed in fieldwork and had never been able to adequately describe in academic language, because the accuracy required wasn't linguistic, but human. "May," the woman said. "May," Naomi repeated. "Is May here?" The woman shook her head, began to say something else. A location, a timeline. How long ago? Where? And Naomi listened and translated simultaneously, speaking quietly to Kieran, who was 2 feet behind her. And he relayed to his people who were already moving, and in the next 40 minutes, 3 other locations within the terminal were found and cleared, and the number of people who had been in those containers and were now somewhere safer climbed past 80 and kept climbing. She didn't stop. She moved from person to person, from language to language. Fujian dialect, standard Mandarin. A Tagalog speaker she found near the north container who had given up trying to communicate entirely until Naomi crouched down and said 3 words in the right register and watched the woman's face do the thing that face had just done. She documented. She took names, destinations, the fragments of information that would be needed for what came next. The legal aftermath that always follows these situations and is never as neat as the moment of intervention. She was aware of Kieran throughout. The way you're aware of weather, not because you're watching it, but because it's the conditions surrounding everything else. He moved through the terminal with his people, calm and precise. and she noticed he spoke to each of his team members directly, knew their names, used them, and that the men he was managing tonight were not afraid of him in the way she'd been afraid of him in the restaurant. They were something more complicated than afraid, something that looked like belief. Victor Chen was not at the terminal. That was the thing nobody said out loud, but everyone understood when the last container was cleared and the sweep was complete, and the only people in custody were mid-level operatives who knew parts of the operation, but not the whole of it. Victor had sent his network, but not himself. Victor was somewhere else, watching from a distance that he had carefully maintained throughout everything. The trafficking, the media leak, the immigration filing, the 6 months of pressure on Naomi's life. Always at the end of a supply chain, never at the source. Kieran understood this before she did. She saw it in him when the sweep ended and the confirmation came in that the terminal was clear. Not the expression of someone who has won something, but the expression of someone who has finished the first half of a fight and knows the second half hasn't started yet. She went to him. She was cold now, the adrenaline having done what adrenaline does when it runs out, leaving behind the physical reality of a coastal wind and wet pavement and hands that were still not quite steady. "He wasn't here," she said. "No." "But you knew he wouldn't be." He looked at her. "I knew it was possible." "Then why?" She stopped because she already knew the answer. "The people in the containers." "Yes." "Even if Victor walks away tonight, there are 83 people in this terminal who are not in those containers anymore," he said. It was the most direct thing she had ever heard him say, which was notable because he was not a man who typically said anything indirectly. She stood with that. The wind came off the water, and she felt it in her teeth. "The authorities are going to be here in 20 minutes, he said. "The evidence package my legal team has been preparing. It goes to the International Prosecutor's office tonight, not the local offices Victor has inside. He can't touch that timeline." "Will it be enough?" "For an arrest?" "Not yet." His jaw tightened. "But to cut his operations, his financing, his corridor access, his ability to move anything through the networks he's been building, yes, it will be enough for that." "So we've damaged him," she said, "but he still has everything he needs to come at us again." "Yes," Kieran said, "which is why what happens next matters more than tonight." She looked at him. He was looking at something over her shoulder, and she turned to follow his eye line and saw, at the north perimeter of the terminal, 2 vehicles she didn't recognize. Not Kieran's, not the police advance unit that was on its way. They had been there for a while. She could tell from the small detail of condensation on the windshields, the vehicles running without lights, and the fact that neither car had moved despite the activity in the terminal, because they weren't here to see the activity. They were here to be seen. Victor Chen, who never came in person, had sent something that functioned as a message. "We were here. We watched. We are not finished." She felt something happen inside her that was different from fear. It had the temperature of fear, but a different texture, something harder, something that had been accumulating since the night she stood in her father's hallway and made the choice to run instead of confront. And that had been growing through every week of contract negotiation and public performance and intercepted communications and 60-second immigration interviews until it had reached, tonight, in a container terminal smelling of diesel and the sea, a mass that was no longer manageable. "I want to end this," she said, "not damage it. End it." He turned to look at her. "Victor operates because people are afraid to expose him completely," she said. "Not because the evidence doesn't exist. It exists. I've been reading his communications for 6 hours, and there is enough in those files to build a case that no prosecutor could ignore." She held his gaze. "But it has to come from someone who can stand in front of an international authority and testify. Not just submit documents. Testify." She paused. "I can do that." "If you testify, you become the target," he said. "Not the hidden piece. The visible one." "I'm already visible," she said. "Victor put my face in the press today. I'm visible whether I choose to be or not." She took a breath of the cold, salt air. "The difference is whether I'm visible running or visible standing still." The 2 cars at the north perimeter hadn't moved. She could feel them the way you feel something watching you. Not imagination, but the actual physical reality of being in someone's sightline. "There is a gala," Kieran said slowly. "In 4 days. The Meridian Charity Foundation. Every significant power broker in the city will be there. Politicians, executives, international partners. He said it the way he said most important things, as if he was placing each word carefully to see how the structure held. Victor will be there. He attends every year. It's the one event he doesn't send proxies to, because the connections made there are worth more than the risk. She understood what he was saying. You want to confront him in public, she said. I want you to, he said. Victor has framed you as a fugitive, a criminal accessory, a woman who ran because she had something to hide. If you walk into that room on my arm and you stand in front of him and you do not run, he stopped. It changes the story. The narrative shifts. And Victor's entire operation is built on controlling the narrative. She thought about it. 4 days. A room full of people with enough collective power to matter. Victor Chen in the same physical space, no distance, no supply chain, just air between them and whatever she chose to do with the moment. And if he moves against us there, she said, publicly? Then he shows the room who he actually is, Kieran said, and I make sure the room can't look away. The police vehicles were visible now at the terminal entrance, lights beginning the long approach down the service road. In 4 minutes, they would be here and the situation would shift from Kieran's operation to someone else's, and everything that came next would be managed by systems that moved at a different speed. She looked at the 2 dark cars at the north perimeter one more time. She memorized them, the make, the position, the specific quality of their stillness, because she had learned in the last 6 weeks that stillness was never the absence of something. It was always the presence of something that hadn't moved yet. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he confirmed. She nodded, not because she wasn't afraid. She could feel it clearly, a physical weight distributed across her chest and shoulders, the body's honest accounting of what it understood the stakes to be. She nodded because the fear and the decision were not mutually exclusive, because she had spent her entire adult life being afraid of her father and running from rooms and making herself small enough to survive in spaces that didn't want her. And she was done with the calculation that kept producing the same result. Standing still, it turned out, was the one thing no one had seen coming from her. She turned back toward the vehicles. Min appeared at her side, a new bruise forming along his jaw from the encounter at the car, and he said nothing but walked with her in a way that felt less like guard duty and more like something that didn't have a clean professional category yet. Behind her, she heard Kieran on the phone again, his voice low and controlled, already moving the pieces for 4 days from now. And she understood for the first time with complete clarity that the man she'd grabbed the hand of in the rain was not the man she'd thought she was dealing with in that restaurant, or in the first week of the contract, or in any of the versions of him she'd assembled from observation and inference. The man she'd grabbed the hand of was someone who had been building towards something for a very long time, who had absorbed betrayal after betrayal with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment was worth more than any individual response, and who had been waiting, possibly without knowing it, for someone to walk into his restaurant and sit down across from him and refuse to fold. The police lights were close now. The terminal was full of noise and people and the beginning of the long official aftermath. Somewhere in the city, Victor Chen was receiving a report from the 2 cars at the north perimeter. And in 4 days, in a room full of powerful people, the woman he'd spent months hunting was going to walk through the door and look at him across the distance and not look away. And whatever happened after that was going to be decided not by running or hiding or any of the calculations of survival she had spent her whole life making. It was going to be decided by the things she'd been building toward since the night she stood in her father's hallway and listened and understood and chose. She got in the car. The door closed. The city received her back into itself and carried her forward into the 4 days that remained, and in the front seat, Min touched his bruised jaw once and glanced in the rearview mirror at her and said, in Korean, quietly, "Not bad," with the flashlight. She looked out the window at Seoul moving past in its rivers of light. "Don't tell him," she said. Min faced forward. She heard very briefly the specific sound of someone suppressing something that might have been a laugh. The car moved on through the burning city toward whatever came next, and Naomi Ellis, who had run for 11 days and hidden for 6 weeks, and decoded the language of a man who traded in human lives, sat in the back seat and felt, for the first time since all of this began, something that was not quite calm, but was in the same family as it. The particular steadiness of a person who has stopped calculating the cost of standing up and has simply decided to stand. The 4 days before the gala were the quietest of the entire 6 weeks. Not peaceful. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet. The silence of something that has compressed itself to the smallest possible space before it releases. The apartment felt different after the terminal. She couldn't locate the difference precisely, which bothered her in the abstract way that imprecision always bothered her. But it was there, in the way Kieran moved through rooms, in the way Min stood at the door, in the way she herself sat at breakfast and looked out at Seoul without cataloging threats in the skyline. They were past cataloging. They were in the part that came after. She called her mother on the second morning. The call lasted 47 minutes, which was long for both of them. Her mother was not a woman who had ever found telephone conversation natural, had raised Naomi in the specific emotional dialect of people who show love through action rather than declaration. But this call was different. Her mother had seen the news article. She'd seen Naomi's photograph attached to words like criminal network and organized crime and flight from justice. And she had, in the way of someone who had raised a daughter alone for 20 years after a husband revealed himself to be something other than advertised, waited 3 days before calling because she understood that Naomi would call when she could, and not before. "Are you safe?" her mother said. Not "are you okay?" Not "what is happening?" Not "I saw the news." Just that, the essential question. "Yes," Naomi said. A silence. "The treatment center called. The payments are coming through." "I know." "Naomi." Her mother's voice was the voice of someone choosing words carefully because they understand that the wrong word will close a door and they don't have the energy to wait for it to open again. Who is this man? She sat with that for a moment. Through the study doorway, she could see Kieran at his desk, his back to her, reading something she couldn't see, his shoulders set in the particular posture of someone who is very still by choice rather than by nature. "He's someone who helped me," she said, "when I didn't have any other options." "And now?" She watched Kieran turn a page. His hand moved carefully. She thought about the sailing almanac worn at the spine, the small handwriting that wasn't his. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the truest thing she'd said to anyone in weeks. Her mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word but carried the full weight of one. Then, "Your father called me." The temperature of the room changed, not literally, the quality of it. "What did he want?" Naomi said. Her voice came out flat. "He said he was sorry." A pause. "He said he didn't think they would actually—" Her mother stopped. "He said a lot of things. Did you believe him?" The silence was longer this time. "I believe he's scared," her mother said, which isn't the same thing. "No," Naomi said. "It isn't." They stayed on the line for a while after that without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that didn't need words because both of them knew the terrain well enough to move through it in the dark. "Come home when you can," her mother said finally. "I will," Naomi said. She sat for a long time after the call ended, with the phone in her lap and Seoul doing its enormous thing outside the window, and she thought about her father. Not the man who had sat at the kitchen table settling debts with his daughter's life, but the man before that, the younger man she had photographs of, but no real memory of, the one her mother sometimes referenced in the past tense as if he had died rather than simply become someone else. She thought about what it cost to become someone else, whether you chose it or whether it accumulated in you the way sediment accumulates, one compromise at a time, until one day you looked at what you'd become and either accepted it or didn't. And her father had apparently accepted it, and she had apparently not accepted the version of herself that running had been producing, which was why in 4 days she was going to walk into a room full of powerful people and do the thing she should have done on the night she stood in that hallway. Not run, stand. The gala was held in the Meridian Hall, which was exactly the kind of building that understood its own importance. Marble floors, 20-foot ceilings, the specific acoustics of a space designed to make conversation feel significant. She had been in rooms like this before, at academic functions and tenure dinners, and the conference circuits of a career that operated in the upper register of its field, and she understood the grammar of them, who stood where, who approached whom, the territorial choreography of people performing power at each other across $60 glasses of champagne. She wore a dress she had chosen herself, which was a first. For every previous public appearance, the wardrobe had been coordinated by Kieran's assistant. clothes that were appropriate and correct, and expressed a version of her that was entirely calculated. This dress was dark blue, close-fitting, without the particular armor quality of the previous choices. She had chosen it because it was the dress she would have chosen before any of this, before the running and the contract and the terminal and the 4 days of quiet. She was done performing a version of herself that wasn't. Kieran looked at her when she came out of the bedroom, and he did the thing he sometimes did, which was to not immediately say anything, to simply register what he was seeing with that complete, unhurried attention. "Different," he said. "Yes," she said. He didn't ask why. She'd noticed he'd stopped asking for explanations of things he could read directly. "Victor will have people at every entrance," he said. "He'll see us arrive." "Good," she said. "Let him." They went. She felt Victor Chen before she saw him. That sounds like something it isn't. Not instinct. Not some heightened sense developed through proximity to danger. It was simpler and more mechanical than that. She felt the change in the room. The specific recalibration of attention that happens when two incompatible things occupy the same space. The way a room of people who are all performing normalcy suddenly performs it slightly harder when something enters that requires the performance to be maintained against actual pressure. She was talking to the wife of a trade commissioner, a pleasant woman named Soo Jin, who had opinions about contemporary Korean literature that were genuinely interesting, when she felt the room recalibrate, and she knew without looking that Victor Chen had positioned himself somewhere behind her left shoulder. She kept talking to Soo Jin. She asked a follow-up question about the novelist Soo Jin had mentioned. She listened to the answer. She smiled at the right moment, and in her peripheral vision she located Victor Chen without moving her eyes directly toward him, the way you locate a sound without turning your head, by triangulating the quality of what was around him, the negative space of people who were subtly oriented away from him while pretending not to be. He was shorter than she'd expected. That was always the thing with men whose names functioned as weather systems. The physical reality of them was smaller than the space they occupied in other people's nervous systems. Medium height, well-dressed, a face that was not unkind in repose, which was the most disturbing thing about it, the specific normalcy of the packaging. Beside her, Kieran had gone very still. "I see him," she said quietly. To Soo Jin, she said warmly that she would love to continue this conversation later in the evening, and Soo Jin moved away pleased, and then it was just the two of them in the small bubble of their private geography, and across the room Victor Chen was looking at her with an expression she could read from 40 feet away. Possession. Not anger, not calculation. The specific look of someone who has decided that an object has been temporarily misplaced and is now simply waiting for the logistics of retrieval to resolve themselves. She took a step toward him. She felt Kieran's hand at her elbow. Not stopping her, she understood, but present, the way a structure is present. "Together," he said. Low, just for her. "Together," she said. They crossed the room. Victor watched them come. He didn't move, not a step backward, not a shift in posture. He received them the way he apparently received everything, with the absolute composure of someone who had decided long ago that he was the fixed point and everything else was variable. Two men in his orbit adjusted position slightly, the muscular geometry of protection, but Victor himself raised one hand in a minimal gesture that stilled them. "Naomi," he said. Her name in his mouth had the quality of something he'd been practicing, comfortable, proprietary. "Mr. Chen," she said, "you look well." He said it with genuine appreciation, which was worse than contempt would have been. "Considering?" "Considering what?" she said. "Considering everything you've been through." He glanced at Kieran with the expression of one businessman acknowledging another, a professional assessment stripped of any personal dimension. "You've been well taken care of. I appreciate that." She felt Kieran beside her, and she felt the precise quality of his stillness, and she understood that whatever he was holding back in that moment was significant, and that he was holding it back because she had asked to stand here, and he was letting her stand here, and that was its own kind of statement. "I need you to understand something," she said to Victor, quietly. Not performing it for the room. Not yet. This first, private, for the accuracy of it. My father's debt is not something I inherited. A person is not property. And whatever transaction you believe occurred between you and Robert Ellis is not a transaction I participated in, consented to, or will honor in any form. Victor looked at her with something that was almost patience. Your father made an agreement. My father committed a crime, she said, and so did you. She let that sit for exactly 1 second, both of which are documented. The patience in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Victor Chen did not do dramatic, but something recalculated behind his eyes. You've been busy, he said. Yes. Whatever you think you have, 6 months of your network's communications, she said, decoded. The Fujian dialect your analysts assumed was unreadable. The maritime terminology your couriers used as operational language. The financial transfer patterns through your shell structure in Taipei. She kept her voice the same temperature throughout. The names of the people who were in those containers at Incheon 2 nights ago, their testimonies, collected and documented and submitted to the International Prosecutor's Office 48 hours ago. She paused. Along with a full account of the operation, the logistics chain, and the identity of the men currently in custody who have been offered prosecutorial cooperation agreements that most of them have accepted. The room was doing the thing rooms do when the actual content of a conversation begins to exceed the social container. The people nearest them had gone quiet, not obviously, not performatively, but in the way of people who are recalibrating their attention without wanting to be seen doing it. Victor's eyes moved to Kieran. You're going to let her do this here? She's not doing anything that wasn't already done, Kieran said. The filing happened 2 days ago. This is just conversation. This is a mistake, Victor said. His voice had changed. Not louder. Victor didn't get louder, she suspected, ever. But the texture of it had shifted, the specific grain of a man who has moved from managing a situation to recognizing that the situation has moved past management. You have no idea what you've put in motion. I have a precise idea, Naomi said. That's the difference between us. What happened next was not what she had planned, which was the nature of confrontations even when you had planned them carefully. She had imagined Victor would deflect, would excuse himself, would retreat to the distance that had protected him throughout his career. What he did instead was take 1 step toward her, closing the space between them to something intimate and threatening, and say in a voice pitched for only the two of them, Your mother is in a treatment facility. Facilities can have problems. Funding can become complicated. She held his gaze. She felt the threat land in the place where threats land, the animal part of the brain that tracks danger, and she felt her body want to respond the way bodies respond when something they love is threatened, and she did not let it. The payments to my mother's facility, she said, are managed through a legal trust that was established independently of any business arrangement. It cannot be accessed or interrupted by any party, including Kieran, including me, including anyone you could reach. She'd spent day 2 of the 4 quiet days ensuring exactly that, sitting with Han for 3 hours restructuring the financial arrangement into something that could survive every outcome. You have nothing that touches her. His eyes changed. She watched the calculation in them complete itself, watched him arrive at the place she had arrived at 2 days ago, the place where the exits had all been mapped and none of them were accessible. The filing with the International Prosecutor's Office, she continued, still quiet, still even, includes a section on witness intimidation. Any contact with my family, any contact with the treatment facility, any contact with any individual connected to my life constitutes an additional criminal act that adds to an existing evidentiary record. She paused one last time. I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Chen. I want you to understand that concretely, not as a performance. I'm telling you what exists and what it means. What you do with that information is the last decision in this conversation that belongs to you. Victor Chen looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. Beside her, Kieran did not move. Behind Victor, the 2 men in his orbit were receiving silent instructions from someone in an earpiece, the kind of micro-logistics she had learned to read over 6 weeks of sitting in rooms where invisible communication happened constantly. Then Victor stepped back. 1 step. The geometry of retreat dressed as recomposition. Enjoy the evening, he said. He turned and walked away, and the room exhaled without knowing it was exhaling, and she watched him go and waited until he had crossed to the far side of the space and disappeared through a side corridor before she let herself take a breath that went all the way to the bottom of her lungs. Kieran's hand, which had been at her elbow throughout, moved to the small of her back. not performance. The room was watching other things now. It was just the physical fact of a hand placed with deliberate care. "Are you all right?" he said. "Ask me in 20 minutes, she said. He almost smiled. She saw it in her peripheral vision, the half motion of it, the thing his face did when something broke through the controlled surface, which was rarer than everything else he did, and visible only if you had been paying close attention for long enough. She had been paying close attention for long enough. Victor Chen was arrested 11 days later, not at a dramatic moment, not in a room full of witnesses, or at the culmination of a confrontation designed for maximum exposure. He was arrested at 7:40 in the morning outside a restaurant in Apgujeong, where he had breakfast every Thursday, by two officers from the International Prosecutors Task Force, who had been building the case for 18 months and now had, thanks to the documentation submitted by Kieran Hwan's legal team and the decoded communications provided by a linguistics professor from UCLA, enough to close it. She read about it on her phone in the university library at 9 a.m. She had returned to Seoul National University as a visiting scholar 3 weeks after the gala, a position arranged by a faculty contact who owed her a professional favor and seemed genuinely delighted by the particular specialty she was bringing to their linguistics department. She was teaching one graduate seminar and conducting research on minority maritime dialects of the South China Sea, which was a topic that had recently developed a new dimension of personal relevance. She sat in the library with her phone and read the article twice, and then set the phone face down on the table and looked at the stack of documents in front of her and thought about what it felt like to have the thing you'd been running from stop moving. It felt, she found, less like relief and more like silence. The specific silence of a sound you've been hearing so long you stopped registering it, and now it's gone, and the absence is its own adjustment. Her father was mentioned in paragraph 7 of the article. Former diplomatic attaché Robert Ellis, whose financial arrangements with Chen's organization initiated the chain of events, had been formally stripped of his diplomatic credentials and was under investigation by federal authorities in the United States. There was no quote from him. She had not spoken to him since the night she stood in the hallway. She did not anticipate speaking to him soon. There was a door in her that had been open her whole life, and she had recently, quietly, and without ceremony closed it. She didn't know if it would stay closed. She suspected it might open again someday, in a different way, for different reasons. The way damaged things sometimes find configurations that are more honest than the original. But that was not today's question. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Kieran was in the apartment when she returned that evening. This was not unusual. He was most evenings now, the criminal operations having undergone a dismantling that had taken the first month after the gala and had proceeded with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. The legitimate enterprises were absorbing the personnel and infrastructure. Han was managing the legal restructuring. The shipping networks were being registered, licensed, documented, brought into the light by the same man who had built them in the dark, which was a kind of testimony to something she hadn't found the right word for yet. He was reading when she came in. The sailing almanac. She recognized the spine. She set down her bag and sat across from him, and he looked up. "He was arrested," she said. "I know." A pause. "How do you feel?" She considered the question seriously because it was asked seriously. "Like, I need to figure out what to do with energy I've been using for something that doesn't need it anymore," she said. "Like, the emergency is over and I don't immediately know how to be someone for whom the emergency is over." He held her gaze. "That takes time," he said. "I've been told." She looked at the almanac. "Whose was that?" she said. "Before it was yours." He looked down at it. His thumb moved along the worn spine once, unconsciously, the gesture of someone who has handled something enough times that the motion has stopped being intentional. "My father's," he said. She had known it would be that, and had asked anyway because some things need to be said in order to exist in the space between two people, rather than merely being understood. "What was he like?" she said. Kieran was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, which would have been its own answer. Then, "Careful," he said. He was very careful about the things he believed in. He didn't say them loudly. He just organized his life around them. A pause. The legitimate enterprise model.
The idea that you could build something real without it costing the wrong things. He was trying to make that work when he was killed. He looked up at her. I spent 10 years thinking the lesson of that was that what he believed in was wrong, that careful didn't protect you, and principles were a liability. He looked back at the almanac. I've been revising that assessment. She sat with what he'd said. Outside, Seoul was beginning its evening, the shift from the white light of working hours to the warm and neon-saturated version of itself that came out after dark. The city she had run through in the rain, believing she was running toward somewhere safe, and had instead run toward something she still didn't have complete language for. The contract expires in 4 days, she said. Yes. You've had Han prepare the dissolution documents. It wasn't a question. She knew he had because she knew how he operated, which was to manage every outcome in advance so that the moment of decision was never contaminated by administrative chaos. Yes, he said. I'd like to see them, she said. He looked at her. She met his eyes. I want to read what we're either signing or not signing, she said, before we decide. Something moved across his face, the controlled surface shifting, the thing beneath it briefly visible, the specific and unguarded expression of someone who has been carrying a question they were afraid of the answer to and has just been told there might be a different answer available. He stood. He went to the desk. He came back with a folder and set it on the table between them. She opened it. She read through it with the same attention she brought to everything she read, which was total, and he sat across from her and let her read and did not rush her. The documents were correct, legally clean. Everything they had entered into together dissolved with appropriate financial settlements, mutual obligations discharged, both parties released. It was a good document. Han was very good at his job. She read it all the way to the end. She closed the folder. She pushed it back across the table. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. I didn't run, she said. When I finally stopped running, the thing I found on the other side of it wasn't the person I expected. She put her hands flat on the table, both of them, the gesture she made when she needed her body to be as honest as her words. I expected to find myself, my previous self, the academic, the careful person with the mapped-out career and the manageable life. She paused. I found someone different, someone I think I actually prefer. She held his gaze. And I'm not entirely sure I would have found her without you. The room was very quiet. She could hear Seoul outside, the continuous, low-grade sound of a city living its life. I'm not the same person I was 6 weeks ago either, he said. His voice was different, slower. The controlled precision of it relaxed into something that sounded more like the actual timbre of him, the voice underneath the voice. The person I was 6 weeks ago was trying to build something legitimate while still holding everything the old way, not letting anyone too close to the actual machinery. He looked at her directly. You got into the actual machinery. I know, she said. You let me. I did, he said. That was not something I had done before. She turned the folder over so the documents faced down. It was a small gesture. He saw it. What do you want? He said. Not the question of the contract negotiation, not the strategic assessment of mutual benefit. The other kind. The kind that didn't have a procedural answer. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere else to go. I have a career and a faculty position waiting and a life in Los Angeles that I could return to tomorrow. She let that stand clearly. I want to stay because this is where I want to be, because the work I'm doing here matters, and because my mother's treatment is stable, and because Seoul is a city I've been underestimating for years, and because... She stopped. Let the because hang there, unfinished. The linguist in her knew that the most important things were often the ones that resisted completion. He understood. She could see that he understood. The legitimate business structure, she said. The international networks, the logistics, the companies Han is bringing into registration. You're going to need someone who speaks the languages, not just Korean, all of them, the regional ones, the dialects, the communication patterns between cultures that don't always have a common vocabulary. She held his eyes. I'd like to be that person, formally, with a title and a role and a contribution that doesn't depend on performing a marriage. And the marriage, he said. She looked at him steadily. The marriage already exists, she said. We signed it in a conference room at 4 in the morning while Han drank terrible coffee and a city tried to remove me from it. The corner of her mouth moved. I'd like to find out what it is when it isn't a tactic. He was quiet. She watched him process it, not hesitating, not building resistance, just the internal movement of someone who has arrived at something they've been moving toward without knowing it and needs a moment to recognize the territory. He reached across the table, not reaching for the folder. His hand settled on top of hers, both of them flat on the table, and it was the most deliberate thing she had ever seen anyone do with such a small gesture. The weight of intention behind it, the careful placement of it, the way he did nothing quickly that mattered. All right, he said. 2 words. She had spent her career arguing that language was the most precise instrument humans had, that the right words in the right order carried more than any other medium of human expression. She still believed that. She also believed, newly, in the specific adequacy of 2 words said with the full weight of a person behind them. All right, she said. Her mother came to Seoul in the spring. The treatment had reached its maintenance phase. The oncologist had used words like remission and monitoring and the particular careful optimism of someone who has learned to give good news as precisely as they give bad. She came for 3 weeks, stayed for 5, and spent most of it being escorted through the city by men who had discovered that Margaret Ellis had extremely strong opinions about food that he found professionally challenging and personally fascinating. Naomi's mother met Kieran on the second evening. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, steadily, without decoration, taking the measure of what was in front of her. She asked him 2 questions over dinner. The first was about his father's business, which Naomi had told her about in outline, if not in detail. The second was not a question she announced as such. She simply said, cutting her food, "My daughter has never needed taking care of, but she has occasionally needed someone to stand next to." She looked at her food, then at him. "You seem like someone who understands the difference." Kieran held her gaze. "I'm learning," he said. Her mother made the sound that meant she considered that an acceptable answer. After dinner, when Kieran had gone to deal with a call and her mother and Naomi were alone in the kitchen in the specific late evening comfort of women who know each other well enough to be in the same room without filling it, her mother said, "Your father called again." "I know," Naomi said. "I listened to the message." "Are you going to call back?" She dried a glass. Set it down. "Eventually," she said, "when I know what I want to say." She looked at her mother. "I haven't decided yet whether there's anything worth saying." Her mother nodded. "Don't decide before you're ready," she said. "But don't let it wait so long it calcifies." A pause. "Some doors close permanently. Some don't. You won't know which kind this is until you try it." She thought about that for a long time after her mother went to bed. She thought about doors and the spaces behind them and the years she had spent managing the distance between what her father was and what she needed him to have been. She thought about calcification and the other thing, the slow and unguaranteed process of something broken, finding a configuration that wasn't what it had been, but was still, possibly, something. She didn't make a decision that night. She made coffee, and she stood at the window and she looked at Seoul in its enormous, glittering, ongoing life, the city that had received her running and cold and terrified, and had given her, in exchange for all of it, something she hadn't known she was looking for because she hadn't known it existed. Kieran came and stood beside her. He had finished the call. He didn't ask what she was thinking, which was one of the things about him she had come to understand was not absence but respect. The difference between someone who doesn't ask because they don't care and someone who doesn't ask because they're willing to wait until you choose to offer. She said, "I think I'm going to call my father." He looked at the window. "When?" "When I know what I want to say." She paused. "I think I'm getting closer." "Take the time you need," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the city, the planes of his face in the window light, the specific quality of his stillness. Not absence, not distance, but the concentrated presence of someone who had learned that being steady was its own form of offering. She thought about the night she grabbed his hand, the 11 seconds in her father's hallway, the rain in Seoul, and the restaurant with the warm light, and the desperate arithmetic of a woman with no more options. She thought about men suppressing a laugh in a car that smelled of gun oil and cold air. She thought about 83 people who were somewhere safer because a woman who spoke their language happened to be in a shipping terminal on the right night. She thought about her mother's face across a dinner table, and a sailing almanac worn thin at the spine, and a contract that had become something neither party had contracted for, and how the most significant things in her life had arrived not through the plans she'd made, but through the moments her plans had collapsed, and something truer had rushed in. She reached out and took his hand. Not like the restaurant, not performance, not survival, just the clean, simple fact of her hand finding his. He turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the one she had been collecting since the beginning, adding to her understanding of it piece by piece, and she thought she finally had enough pieces to know what it was. It wasn't control. It wasn't the careful management of a man who had built walls from fear and loss and kept the world at precisely calibrated distances. It was something that had always been there underneath those things, quiet and patient, waiting for the conditions to be right. It looked like someone who had come home. She faced the window again. Seoul blazed and pulsed in the dark below them, 10 million lives moving through their particular versions of survival and love, and the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of being human inside the circumstances that history and family and accident had placed them in. She held his hand. He held hers. The city went on. There was nothing else that needed to be said, and they were both, finally, people who understood that silence, the right silence, at the right time between two people who had earned it, was not emptiness. It was the sound of everything that had been endured arriving, at last, at somewhere it could rest. The coffee cooled. The city turned. The night went on, and they stood in it together, and that was enough. And then it was more than enough. And then it was simply what their life was. And that was the truest ending either of them had ever been given, and neither of them wasted it.